Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for our speakers for joining us today as well. I invite our attendees to join the conversation today in the chat box, and please put questions for our speakers in the Q&A box as well, and we will get to those questions at the end of the session. We are excited to look back at the 2020 legislative and budgetary year, which just wrapped up late this Monday night, and discuss this upcoming session with you all. My name is Christopher Martin, and I am the Policy Director at Housing California. We have an excellent set of speakers here with us today, and I will let them introduce themselves, starting with Marina Wyant from the California Housing Consortium, who is co-hosting today's unconference session.
Thank you, Chris. Very happy to be here today. Marina Wyant, I'm the VP of Government Affairs with the California Housing Consortium. We're an affordable housing advocacy organization focused on the production and preservation of low and moderate income housing.
And Brian?
Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Augusta. I'm here today on behalf of the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation. And our firm, Public Interest Advocates, represents a number of organizations in the Capitol that we're working on key pieces of legislation that we'll talk about today, including Western Center and Sierra Leone Foundation, Public Advocates, and others. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And Tamika.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Tamika Moss, and I am the founder and CEO of All Home. We are an organization that focuses on homelessness and housing insecurity for the 9-county Bay Area, and acknowledging the relationship between housing and economic security for people experiencing homelessness. And I'm really excited to also be in this conversation with you all today. We've been a part of the 3 Ps Coalition and trying to advance lots of the housing work at the state level. So we're really excited for this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks all. So to begin by setting the context, this year has been a unique year to say the least. There was a lot of optimism as we started this year out around housing and homelessness, as we saw dozens of bills introduced that really set the stage for a truly revolutionary cycle. The governor dedicated his entire State of the State address in February to the topic of homelessness and proposed some truly forward-thinking ideas in that speech, including a new revenue source to address homelessness in an ongoing manner. There were predictions of a strong budget year with a double-digit budget surplus and strong revenues. But as you all know, COVID-19 hit the state hard in March. After it began, the legislature adjourned for an extended recess after passing some emergency funding for homelessness and general COVID-19 response. The governor then kicked off the first in the nation project Room Key, and then they returned for an abbreviated session, and COVID has had a lot of implications on both the legislative cycle, the budgetary impacts with a $54 billion shortfall in the budget, and incredibly short timelines to pass bills. So we'll start with our speakers. Could you please talk about how COVID-19 has impacted the legislative work from your perspective, the way you do your work, how it changed the power dynamics and political dynamics in the legislature, particularly around racial equity?
Sure, I can get started. This has been a crazy year. And I know that we'll talk probably a little bit later about some of the policy implications that COVID-19 raised around housing, in addition to the ones, Chris, you just mentioned. But from sort of a legislative perspective, we were dealing with a very truncated legislative schedule. Unfortunately, bills only were going through one policy committee, so there wasn't robust policy discussions. And then we also had, I think it was a challenging year as a lobbyist working for sort of less politically powerful organizations. Access to members was really limited. Everything being done via phone or email severely kind of impacted access. And so you really had to rely on the hopes that someone's going to call you back or email you back. Where sort of historically we could, when we're in the Capitol building walking around, you can kind of hunt down staff, stay in their office until they want to come in and talk to you, and at least gives you that that opportunity to at least try to pitch good policy. And I was very concerned once we hit May that what we'd end up seeing is really good policy bills not moving forward, and then less good policy actually becoming law. And a lot of that kind of changed anyway as the year went on, but there was some big concerns I had about what was going to end up getting enacted this year.
Let me add to that. I agree that it has been a very unique year. I mean, this is, just from the perspective of those of us who are working up in Sacramento, the Capitol building was closed largely to the public, which is something that has never happened in the history of that building or the institution. And I will say that at first, so some of the bills that we work on have a broad support from the community, and having folks show up in the Capitol and do lobby days, but also show up to hearings and testify in support is a critical part of that work. And, there was one point in the early part of this whole process where we had a bunch of people, as everyone knows, the hearings took place sort of virtually. A limited number of people could be there, but most people called in. And I thought, well, this is unique that we can have people who would otherwise not be able to make the trip to Sacramento have the ability to call in. And I look back on that as being quite quaint, because in fact, that system simply does not work. The notion of virtual democracy is, it works fine, I think, for the voting, but for the actual public interaction, it was kind of a disaster. Anyone who called in and couldn't get recognized by the operator knows exactly what I'm talking about. But I think on the substance too, as Marina is talking about, a lot of the work that happens in Sacramento happens because people are in the Capitol walking around, talking to folks, rumor mongering. But also when you got to negotiate something very critical, you get people in the room and you talk about it. And none of that could happen. So I think one of the takeaways for us from this process, and I think this was an unpopular opinion at various points, but the idea that we were going to sort of continue this unique legislative session as if everything was equally important to the work, I think was a mistake. And as we saw at the end of session, when for a variety of reasons time ran out and bills that, including one that I worked on, died unceremoniously because we ran out of time to hear it on concurrence, even though there was no meaningful opposition to it. That's just, I think, a product of not adjusting to the reality that what we really needed to be focusing on was the housing crisis and COVID response, and really kind of narrow the field to that. And as a result, I think a lot of policy making started happening that probably, luckily some of those bills died, but would have happened in a way that really had no meaningful public input. So I'm hopeful by the time they reconvene, we're not in the same situation, because it's very challenging.
And I just, Brian raised what happened on Monday night, which is a time ran out and a bunch of bills didn't end up getting voted on that may have passed and could have been meaningful bills. But it also highlighted sort of this ongoing conflict between the two houses, and the Assembly and the Senate throughout this session have had slightly different approaches to how they want to deal with the COVID crisis. The way they vote on the floor is slightly different, and so that created different complications. And so also as people who work on policy, when you have that kind of political strife happening between houses, it also negatively impacts the ability to pass bills, because things get tied up in sort of inner house politics, as opposed to just focusing on good policy, good meaningful policy that can really make an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think the other backdrop that COVID presented was the role of the federal government intervening in what was actually happening at the state level. We ended up at All Home, we ended up doing a lot of pivoting to doing advocacy and policy work to ensure that the emergency dollars that were coming into jurisdictions to address homelessness and rental assistance and the various needs that the most vulnerable people in the Bay Area were experiencing were were going to be used well, and supporting the organizations and city and county governments to do that well. So I think the challenge we had was pre-COVID, everybody in the state was clear that homelessness and housing were our priorities. And then we were confronted with, state-sanctioned murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And the conversation changed. And I think we got really the confluence of challenges that I think not only the legislature and the state was contending with, but citizens, people, what was actually happening for people changed the tenor of what got done in Sacramento, what people were fighting for, whether or not there was a consensus around economic and racial justice and how that tied into our housing policy. So I think the entire landscape shifted underneath us, and certainly what Brian and Mariana talked about relative to the very specific truncated schedule and our inability to access our lawmakers directly had a direct impact. But I think it was also in the context and backdrop of these sort of, earth shifting dynamics that I don't think, and they all happened so quickly, I don't think that we were able to respond in a way that really, supported and protected the people who we fight for every day. And so I think that, as Brian said, I'm hopeful that we can catch our breath and figure out how to be much more strategic and thoughtful about our engagement strategies and the policies that we're advancing, because I feel like that was really lost in this session.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I completely agree. It certainly changed a lot of the dynamics in the building, who was able to speak up, who and how they speak up, and the power therefore. And then additionally, to kind of highlight what Tamika was saying there, this year presented the opportunity, unfortunately, but fortunately in some respects, that we were able to start as a state thinking a little bit more on racial equity as it relates to all of our programs. I know that a lot of our state agencies and departments have started to look inner at themselves and start thinking about how these policies impact racial equity. And so, I'm hopeful that, in the coming year, that we can look at that a little bit more intentionally as we move forward, and hopefully have a little bit more time to pause and reflect rather than these very truncated, short sprints of legislative, movement this year. So,
Can I make one last quick point,
yeah.
Chris, because I'm following the chat a little bit. I just want to raise up a point that's being made here about changing the institution to be more responsive in a digital age. And I think one challenge that I see is that the hearing process, in which, typically we turn people out in person to stand in front of a microphone and say, me too, me too, me too, is really only one way to engage. And I think, both from sort of an outside organizing perspective, I think finding other ways for us to engage in this age is probably a critical conversation that's been highlighted by this, because a lot of that matters more before we get to the hearing. The hearing is part theater, but how do we actually engage with decision makers remotely when everyone's in Sacramento? I think I think that's been highlighted by this as well. We need to do better, notwithstanding the technical challenges that a virtual hearing provides.
Totally. All righty. So the next question, as you know, Housing California is partnering with advocates and experts from essential sectors across the state to draw up the roadmap home to holistically address our California housing and homelessness crises. If I were to hand you each a magic wand to create one comprehensive, large-scale solution on housing affordability and homelessness, what would appear? No small question, so good luck.
You want me to go first? I think we need a significant amount of ongoing forever money for affordable housing and homelessness, and projects that are built using those funds should be streamlined for quick project approvals.
Well, I think mine is sort of magic wandy as well, because I think it's really easy to say and hard to figure out. But I think, building on that, I think one critical policy that we've got to solve for here is, how do we get, yes, an ongoing source that's, accessible to building affordable housing at the state level, but that ensures that we're really building housing for those that are most in need, those in the extremely low income category and below. And how do we make sure that we have rental subsidy and the other subsidies that we're going to need to ensure that that is sustainable? Because as we talk about homelessness and we talk about how we're going to solve that problem, if most of the housing, if not all of it, that we're building with state subsidies is not affordable and accessible to that group of folks, then we're really never going to build that solution. And we know that that's a really, really difficult question to answer because it's an expensive question to answer. But we've got to do it if we're really going to address the housing crisis for those who have long been left out of this housing market.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I guess mine is a variation on both of my colleagues' answers. First of all, Chris, I test the assumption that there's just one solution. Part of our challenge is that all of these issues are intersectional. So if we have a production problem for sure, that we are not producing enough housing for people with extremely low incomes. And this isn't necessarily permanent supportive housing. This is just deeply affordable housing for, in the Bay Area, more than 850,000 people who are earning less than 30% AMI. 40% of those households are working. So we're talking about a math problem. And I think if I had a magic wand, I would not only think about a permanent ongoing source, but we have to think about almost a housing credit. Like, how do we fill the gap between what rents are actually costing and what people are earning? And we certainly want to figure out strategies that address the workforce and economic development side. But unless we start figuring out pathways to competitive employment for low income, formerly homeless people, then we're never going to be able to meet the gap. So I would suggest that we think about what could we do with ensuring that folks get the gap filled ongoing in a way to ensure that they're able to stay in their communities and thrive.
Yeah, and Tamika, I love your pivot there in the beginning about this not just being one solution so as to minimize it. I think, as you all know, I probably would say something to the tune of housing and services and health benefits being a human right and an entitlement as opposed to, the system.
A commodity.
So, and that's sector in nature. I think, as we look at the housing and homelessness crisis, we're talking more than just housing resources. We're talking about social services. We're talking about economic benefits. We're talking about, poverty. And so it is cross-sector in nature. And so we have to think about it holistically. So I think, and that is the goal of the roadmap. So I do want to say that as well. So. Alrighty, so looking back at this last year, what policies would each of you highlight, whether it be legislatively, budgetarily, that did get through, what didn't get through, and then, any implications of those that didn't get through and how we look to the future?
I keep going first. I guess that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So, this year, as Chris noted at the top of the hour, we had very high hopes for housing, and things got really derailed because of the new COVID crisis, which drastically impacted both sort of the ability to get stuff done, but also the ability, it kind of created even more challenges for folks on the ground who needed housing. Affordable housing. But so we started the year optimistic. We had several sponsored bills focused on housing production. And unfortunately, I think where we ended up was, at least as an organization, we have one bill that did end up getting signed or passed and is on to the governor, which is AB 434, which would sort of streamline the application process for state funding, multifamily funding programs. So we do think that's meaningful, but really disappointed that we didn't see some of our other major policies move forward. But on the budget side, I think we were really fortuitous that we still were able to get funding for housing production and homelessness this year, in spite of the budget impacts of the COVID crisis, which included an additional $500 million in low-income housing state credits. Last year we saw that, and last year was the first year we had that kind of expansion of the state credit, and it created, I believe, I can't tell you how many units, but a lot. A lot more units. I want to say it was 4,000, but I think it might actually have been more than 4,000 units approved. On production bills, we were focused on a couple key policies that didn't advance. The first was a bill that we worked with Housing California and several other partners on that would have exempted from CEQA both permanent supportive housing projects, affordable housing projects, and some shelters as well. And then unfortunately that bill did not get out of Assembly Natural Resources Committee. It faced opposition from environmental groups and labor groups and others. But I am hopeful that the work that we've done since that bill with some of those constituent groups may help us be successful in the future. We also worked with Housing California on a bill 2988 that would have cleaned up some other provisions related to an existing streamlining bill related to permanent supportive housing. Unfortunately, that one also got embroiled in similar politics as 1907. But there was a bill that Assemblywoman Friedman was carrying, AB 2323, also did not end up moving due to labor and environmental opposition. That bill was sort of tinkering around the edges, making a few cleanup provisions to some of the existing CEQA exemptions. But through our work on that bill, we spent a lot of time with the environmental community, I think educating folks on sort of the benefits of affordable housing and why CEQA at times has blocked really valuable affordable housing projects. And so I'm hopeful from the work and the engagement we did with 2323 that will really translate to a bill similar to 1907, but for next year. And then additionally on some other production bills that did not move forward, we were also sponsoring a bill that would have permitted residential development in certain commercial zones so long as the 20% of those units were affordable to lower income households. And that bill really seemed to be moving along very nicely, and we had broad support, very little opposition. Most of the opposition was coming from some local, near typical local community groups. But that bill, this is sort of harkening back to my comments about some of the inner house politics. A couple months after we introduced that bill, the Senate introduced a similar bill that had similar policy, but without the affordability provisions. And so we ended up kind of being engaged in significant conversations throughout the summer between sort of the two bills and how do we reconcile those two bills that are doing so much of the same, but with very different approaches on affordability. And again, unfortunately, our bill 3107 had sort of late labor opposition and did not end up moving forward. And then 1385 never dealt with the affordability issues and some of the environmental issues. And so that bill also did not move forward. So it was, again, a strange situation where you have two bills from both houses, clearly priorities from the legislature, but both failed to move to advance and pass. And I think that there are a couple other bills that on the production side that did end up passing the legislature on Monday night dealing with density bonus law. One bill, 2345, kind of expands sort of the amount of density bonus you can get if you produce more affordable units than the current law allows. And also reduces parking minimums for 100% affordable projects, as well as a few other items that are helpful to 100% affordable projects. And then SB 1085 is another bill that touches on density bonus law that would allow ownership units to take advantage, all ownership kind of condo units to take advantage of density bonus for providing moderate income housing. So that's kind of, you know, a couple good things, a lot of not as good things to move forward. I'll let Brian can talk perhaps a bit later about AB 1279, since that was a bill he worked on, but there were a couple other bills dealing with by right housing development. SB 899 by Senator Wiener would have allowed development of 100% affordable projects on religious owned sites, also ended up not moving forward. And I think sort of the overall tenor that we were struggling with as affordable housing advocates was a lot of the housing production bills that were introduced did not have a lot for affordable housing production. So, you know, I'm highlighting some of the ones that we worked on, that we cared about, that were about promoting the production of affordable housing. And I would say, you know, largely the Senate housing package that was introduced in late April mostly touched on market rate housing production with very little affordability requirements and very few benefits for affordable housing development. And really hope to see a change in that moving forward as well.
Well, we don't have to keep going in the same order. Do you want to go next?
Sure. You know, I think Mariana just sort of gave the wrap, I think, on the bills that were not successful. And I guess I just want to highlight a couple of themes. You know, we did a post-mortem with our coalition partners. And I think what was most disappointing was that even in the midst of, you know, an economic and health crisis, a housing crisis, we weren't able to figure out a collection of bills that would at least start working toward our collective goals, which is to produce more affordable housing, which is to fund, create opportunities to address homelessness. And a lot of the, you know, we sort of committed, I think, as a community to working together last cycle on protections, and we got 1482 passed, and it was incredibly extraordinary what we were able to do together. And I think that, you know, this year was clearly an effort to look at production and do some streamlining, and I feel like we were so unsuccessful in collectively coming together to position ourselves for increasing affordable housing and housing for extremely low income people that in some ways it feels like we've gone backwards in terms of what our baseline is. If we know we have millions of units that we need to build at levels of affordability that poor people can afford, we got to get busy. We got to get past the sort of political infighting that continues to plague this sector. And certainly in Sacramento, I think we saw that happen. And so just thematically, I'm excited to figure out how do we come together, not only as a sector of advocates, stakeholders, community-based organizations, people with lived expertise. We have people literally dying on the street, and we need to get out of our own way and figure out how to be more productive in our efforts. And I will say on the budget side, being able to see some leadership around Project Home Key and Room Key allowed us to, you know, ensure that people experiencing homelessness were provided support through the health crisis, and now being able to turn those assets into permanent assets in communities across the state is important. And we have to do more. That is a piece of the pie and the solution set, but I think we would be remiss to feel like that's as much as we need to do relative to the scale of the problem. So just overall commentary of where I think we are as reflected by what landed on the cutting floor, and where I hope that we can get to as a community.
Yeah, the cutting room floor is, I think, a really important comment. I mean, I was going to start by saying that, as Marina just sort of outlined, but the I think the story of 2020, not just with respect to housing bills, but a lot of other policies, housing and homelessness bills, but a lot of other policies, is just the story of what didn't happen. I mean, I think even bills that made it all the way through the process, and I had one that fell victim to that as well, and didn't get out because of some, late night fighting between the houses. But there were a lot of other stumbling blocks on the way there. And so, Marina outlined some of the other things, but we had bills this year on strengthening code enforcement protections, strengthening relocation benefits, a number of other policies that we had to pull the plug on fairly early when the COVID crisis came. And I think there was a somewhat slow pivot to that and really trying to focus in on what should be the key policies. I think it's notable that I guess 1085 was in the package, but I don't believe any of the other Senate housing bill package moved forward, right? And so what story does that tell in the middle of a housing crisis that's only been made worse by COVID? But in addition to everything that Marina outlined, I think the big story for us had been the impacts, the economic impacts of the COVID crisis, right? And a very quick pivot to reacting to the fact that our economy was literally shutting down and record numbers of unemployment in terms of like sudden unemployment for so many people. And the impact that had very immediately on renters, but also clearly has had and will have on housing providers as well. But the tough reality that we all faced as the crisis began and continued to unfold was the reality that for many people that all of us at this conference are concerned with, right? Those who cannot find housing that they can afford in the sort of open rental market, right? Those folks are paying 60 or 70% of their income for rent, are suddenly 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 months out of work. They were having a hard time paying the rent as it was. They're not going to come up with the back rent of 3 or 4 months worth of unpaid rent. And so that money's just not there. And so it began a very urgent conversation about what that means in terms of the potential for mass evictions, what that means for the sustainability of portions of the rental housing market. And at the end of the day, much of that, I think, is an as yet unsolved question of money. But we had to act immediately to ensure that we weren't going to see mass displacement. And so I think, that was a big part of our work this year, was to first turn to the governor to use his executive authority, which he did, although we believe a lot of what the real protections that came were from the Judicial Council and the Chief Justice stepping in and putting an eviction moratorium in place. And we think that moratorium, which just ended yesterday, has been a critical piece of ensuring that we're not seeing mass evictions, and gave us some time to turn our attention to the question of what are we going to do about that. And, I think as this conversation has evolved this year around that very crisis, we had SB 1410 that leadership put in place that would have established a tax credit, which came back with like a $10 billion price tag for just year one of that tax credit. So that was clearly a very expensive proposition. And then I think there were a lot of conversations about what role could the state play to ensure that we could, help close that gap for people who couldn't pay the rent. But we also needed to work on ensuring that people were not going to be summarily evicted for not being able to pay the rent. Because at the end of the day, if that happened, our sort of nation-leading homelessness crisis was only going to get worse. The resulting policy, well, first there was AB 1436, which a number of organizations that we work with sponsored. And that bill provided a fairly robust policy solution that proved, as we'll talk about in sort of the next set of questions, proved to be somewhat unpopular. But we were really trying to deal with the fact that if you can't pay the rent, and the rent isn't there for the reasons I was talking about a moment ago, is eviction really the solution? And that morphed into what eventually was passed 2 nights ago. Was, can you still hear me? Which was AB 3066, which essentially provides, for those who haven't followed the details, a solution on the rent that is owed till now, that can never be the basis for eviction. The landlord can try to claim that money in small claims court. And then a going forward policy that only gets us to February, really to the end of January, that ensures that people can't be evicted if they provide at least 25% of the rent that's being asked for. And there's a lot more detail in there, but which we can talk about when we get to questions and answers if there's still more questions about it. But that's really a stopgap. And as many people have noted, doesn't deal with a whole category of other folks who may face eviction. So we have a lot of work to do on that question. And part of the reason that solution only got us to February is that everyone wants to look to the feds. As I said a moment ago, where is the financial relief for this coming from? The state has said we don't have the money. And I think that's a big conversation for next year. We need more money. We need additional revenue. But we do need to look to the feds as well to provide some of that relief. And I don't know the prospects of that between now and next January, but that is where the conversation is headed, is how do we, once we know some of that, then we can craft some additional solutions. But there's still a huge gap not addressed by 3088, which is a whole host of folks could face eviction for reasons other than non-payment of rent. And that rule that was stopping that evaporated yesterday. So I think that's going to be part of the ongoing conversation over the next several months, is what we do about that. And then one other piece of policy related to that was lifted up and then by Housing California, but not in this crazy year that we've had and moving forward, which is, will we see a replay of a different version of what we saw in the 2007 mortgage meltdown, which is a huge number of foreclosures of rental housing property, and then investors swooping in and buying up those properties? And how do we instead leverage that to get more housing into social ownership? I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation as well that did not get addressed this year. So let me pause there and hand it to Chris, because I think there's also some really important bills on homelessness that came and went, and some that are on the governor's desk, and want to see what you want to say about some of that.
Can I respond real quick though to Brian? I think Brian highlighted sort of the funding piece is so critical for how we keep people stably housed ongoing in this crisis. We were very concerned when the COVID crisis first hit on what this is going to do to the affordable housing portfolio. Affordable housing providers already generally are operating with very slim margins. Their rents are low, operating expenses can be very high, and so the margins can be very slim. And so reductions of rent collections by 10, 25% even can have significant impacts on the properties. And if a property dips below sort of the line, and if an deed restricted affordable housing project is foreclosed on, that project would lose all of its deed restrictions and really threaten the stability of all the residents in those properties. So we were also really trying to engage with the administration and legislature on the need to provide some sort of break-even rental assistance for affordable housing developments, and ensure that those were kept solvent. And we're pleased that in AB 3088, there is the language that, about bringing together stakeholders for discussions over the fall and in January if there are federal resources. But it's going to be very concerning if there aren't federal resources, how we keep those projects financially feasible. And I think we really saw a lot of affordable housing providers were working with tenants, putting them on payment plans, helping them apply for unemployment benefits. And sort of anecdotally, what we've heard from a lot of the providers is that it seems like many of their tenants have been really prioritizing paying their rents in affordable developments. And many of them seem to be on unemployment, and that additional unemployment assistance that was coming from the federal government was really critical for their ability to pay rent. And so we're very concerned about what's going to happen now that those dollars are not coming in, and what that's going to do to especially projects that don't have additional like Section 8 subsidy dollars coming in, but that are serving some of our most needy households, that, you know, the ELI households that folks have been talking about earlier, since those rents are so low.
Well, on the homelessness side of things, you know, not to harp on how we started the year, but I'd be remiss without continuing to mention that we had a governor dedicate his entire State of the State address to the issue of homelessness, and not 2 weeks later we had the wrench thrown in of COVID-19, which really distracted the state away from that issue, because then, you know, in that State of the State speech, and I'm sure I'll talk about this a little bit more thoroughly when we get to the next year thing, the governor explicitly said he wanted to look at an ongoing source of revenue to address homelessness. We've never heard a governor even want to address that question, let alone bring it up himself. So I think that was huge, and a huge step in the right direction. Of course, COVID hit. We had a budget shortfall this year, and the state had to pivot. And I do want to give a lot of credit to the administration and particularly HCD for all of the work that's been done on Project Room Key and Project Home Key, really recognizing that people experiencing homelessness are arguably the most at risk for exposure to COVID-19 and the most vulnerable. And so the governor and the state really took that to heart and immediately prioritized people experiencing homelessness through the Project Room Key program, and then more recently making that pivot to the permanent housing aspect of this in Project Home Key. And so I know that the state has done an incredible amount of work prioritizing people experiencing homelessness on that front, and HCD getting out a NOFA in that time period. I'd be remiss if I didn't give them a strong shout out for getting out a NOFA in that kind of speed. It's incredible to see that work. So I do want to highlight that. But on the legislative side of things, as Marina talked about, we had some bills, the CEQA exemption bill, and then 2988 that we started out the year with that were really strong bills. But, on the homelessness side, we specifically had a few I want to highlight. We started the year with the bill 2329 from Assemblymember David Chu, which is a topic that, we've talked about for a couple of years now, which was to do a gaps and needs analysis to understand where the gaps are in the state's response to homelessness, and what it would take to get us there to fully addressing homelessness. And so that bill moved to the place where all good bills go to die, which is Appropriations Committee, and was held in the First House Appropriations Committee, but then brought into a different bill that is one of the more ambitious bills around homelessness we've seen in recent years, also from Assemblymember David Chu, which is AB 3269. That bill, started as something that came out of the Governor's Council of Regional Homeless Advisors, led by Mayor Steinberg and Supervisor Ridley Thomas. And they put forward this idea of putting together a statewide mandate to get jurisdictions in the state to finally address homelessness in a meaningful way and meet some local benchmarks to addressing homelessness, of course, all grounded in this needs and gaps analysis. And so that AB 2329 was incorporated into 3269 so that as the kind of to assess the benchmarks and lead to a reduction in homelessness, in the next 10 years. And that was, we had the goal of a 90% reduction or even getting to functional zero, which is an ambitious goal, but something that, we need at the state to finally look at, setting benchmarks and goals to meeting some kind of threshold to addressing homelessness and holding ourselves accountable to meeting that. And so that bill 3269 was held in the Second House Appropriations Committee, And so it isn't moving forward this year, but I know that those that worked on the bill, myself, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, Mayor Steinberg, Mayor Schaaf, Supervisor Ridley Thomas, and dozens of supporters and mayors and counties, that we're going to bring that back next year and work on meeting that goal of that bill and the intention behind that bill. We did a lot of work at the end of session and to make that bill workable with the counties and the cities, and I think we're in a really good place to bring that one back next year. One bill that did make it through this year, and I'm excited to talk about, is AB 1845. And this is a bill that is looking at the existing structure we have for addressing homelessness, which I'm sure many know the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council created a few years back, 4 years now, to address homelessness and coordinate our state's response. That council sits within the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, or BCSH, and this bill would take the council and move it up into the governor's office under a new Office to End Homelessness, which would, we believe, provide them the statutory authority to be able to coordinate these agencies in a meaningful way and be able to lead to the streamlining, to the efficiencies we need to address homelessness and create a single point of authority, a single secretary to end homelessness, which the governor, talked about on his campaign trail. He called it a czar at the time. And so, that bill is really trying to meet that need and meet that single point of authority so that we can have, one person that's being accountable in leading our state's response to homelessness. It was authored by Assemblymember Luz Rivas, and the bill is, it made it through, and it is headed to the governor's desk for signature. And so we're excited that that's moving forward. I will say that there was a great op-ed published this morning in the Chronicle from Mayor Schaaf and Mayor Tubbs that I am happy to share with folks. It's going to be on Housing California's social media. So really well-written piece about the need to sign that bill. And so we're hoping that the governor does sign that one. And of course, I wouldn't be a lobbyist if I didn't say, if you're willing to help out, send a letter to the governor, feel free to reach out to me. We would love your support. So moving to the next question, before we talk about next year, I wanted to specifically ask about, anything we've learned as a result of COVID-19, how we think about the way we do our work, any things that it's exposed, particularly on racial equity and the disproportionate impacts COVID-19's had on people of color. And so wanted to offer that up.
Yeah, maybe I'll start us off, Chris. I mean, I think that, it is incredibly clear to those of us who have been doing this work for a really long time that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people have been disproportionately impacted by homelessness, poverty, and negative health outcomes. And the sort of quest and journey to racial equity has been trying to solve those issues in a meaningful way. And I think COVID really laid bare what we have all known. I will say, in some ways, I think that there are limited tools for us to focus our energies specifically on those disparate impacts, whereby we have incredible disproportionality of Black and Brown people experiencing homelessness across the state, and yet our policies are almost race neutral. And so to me, one of the takeaways has been that we have to get really serious of not just talking about racial equity, but actually fighting for racial justice. And I think we've heard throughout the conference, my colleague and friend Amanda Anderi from Funders to End Homelessness really speaks eloquently about what it means to go from fighting for racial equity, which means both acknowledging that the inequities exist, but what it then means to fight for racial justice, which is doing something about it. And I feel like we are in a moment where, homelessness and housing insecurity is not happening for everyone. Now, more people are impacted because of the economic depression that we're in with COVID-19. More people are experiencing health risks, but our Latinx community are devastatingly impacted by the COVID experience because they had to go out there and work and expose their families in small, crowded housing conditions when they came home. So these are not philosophical issues. These are realities that our community has been experiencing for a really long time. And I am heartened by some of the conversations that are beginning to happen across the state, both from the administration and the legislature, about why racial equity is important. But I think we have to move from the awareness position and actually figure out, what do we do when we know that our service delivery systems or our housing policies are producing disparate impacts? How do we pivot? How do we change and mitigate those impacts in real time to ensure that the people who continue to be negatively impacted are not those that have a perpetual trend line in that direction? And so I am really trying to maintain some optimism in that, this is a moment not just of like reflecting on the last cycle, but racial equity is not optional. We have to figure out how to move forward around taking action to reduce racial disparities among people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity if we're serious about ending homelessness. And I think that is the question. I believe that people mean it, that it's not disingenuous, but we have to, again, translate that into the political will, the resources, and the cultural competent service delivery systems that are actually going to be applied to reduce those disparities. And I think that there's a lot of work that All Home and many of our other colleagues across the state are really interested in rolling our sleeves up and figuring out how we take on a position of racial justice and housing justice.
I want to pick up on that theme a little bit too, if I could. And I think, speaking of those structural inequities that were really pointed out by this process, and, I think the other aspect of this that COVID has pointed up is the limits of a housing market that is dependent on the commodification of housing. And when we saw this sudden crisis emerge that really put at risk the housing security of millions of people, that system of the commodification did not bend to the needs that we have. And when you add to that Black and brown folks are something like twice as likely to face eviction as their white counterparts, and you have the conversations that we were having in the legislature and in the public about whatever solutions may be needed here, eviction is not a meaningful solution, and having it come back as, but that's the only way I can get people to pay the rent, that's the only way I can make people do what I need them to do, that's the only solution, even though it's not going to put any more money in anyone's pocket because that money isn't there. And then when you add to that the disproportionate number of people who are people of color who are renters, because we have the lowest home ownership rate among African Americans in 2 decades or more, right? And we have this disproportionate number of folks who face eviction. To me, it was a very eye-opening conversation about sort of the whole conversation that we all want to have about getting more housing into social ownership, creating more assets for people of color through home ownership. Those questions, I think, had we solved those decades ago, we would be having a slightly different conversation in this crisis about whether the right response here, and I should say also public investment, because if the answer from the federal government was, we've done what we're going to do, and the answer from the state government was, we don't have the dollars, and it really was, at the end of the day, a question about finances, that we haven't made that shift. And so suddenly we're looking at a housing market that the response to a crisis like the one we're facing of an economic crisis for millions of renters, that the default solution is to turn to a summary process in the eviction court that would put more people on the streets and disproportionately people of color on the streets, that was the default solution that we had to fight against, and having very difficult conversations with policymakers about why that's not the right solution. I think that just helped elevate sort of all the structural inequities that my colleague was talking about, because I think until we solve those, we're going to continue to see those kinds of problems emerge. And so it's, I think, pointed up a real conversation about how do we deal with, how do we address those inequities, and how do we address getting more housing security that doesn't rely on sort of a private housing market that has only one answer to this sort of crisis, which is, I'm going to move on to the next renter, which just isn't an answer when you've got 5 million renters potentially who couldn't make the rent. So I think that's really the thing that we're going to need to be talking about in the months ahead and the years ahead if we're going to solve some of those problems.
Marina, do you have anything to add on the COVID question, or should we move forward?
You can move forward.
All right, great. Well, the next question is, obviously the next legislative cycle starts in T-minus 3 months and 5 days. And what do you all see as big themes for the coming year? Any policies you plan to pursue? And let's try and keep all of us to one so that we can have some time for Q&A. So yeah, I'll let you guys take it from there.
I will continue going first. So I want to address, as part of sort of I think my thoughts for next year, some of the questions that are in the Q&A related to some of the labor opposition we dealt with this year. And I think first and foremost, I think, we would like to be working very closely with labor and towards a universal solution that both means good paying jobs for our labor workforce, for our construction workforce, as well as more affordable housing. And so it was unfortunate that we kind of hit this impasse this year. I think it's also important to make clear that what the impasse was not around prevailing wage, which are good wage jobs, but really about going beyond sort of what was the place we had been historically with labor, which was including prevailing wage jobs as a condition of development for a lot of the streamlining bills. So my hope for the next year is that we can find a solution with labor and work with them as partners. And this sort of package of policies that I would like to work on really do include sort of ongoing funding that we discussed kind of at the beginning of this hour, as well as including some modified versions of the bills that we worked on that stalled, including some kind of streamlining or CEQA relief for affordable housing developments, zoning related bills, both those that sort of open up some of the exclusionary communities and single family zone communities to affordable development, as well as clear opening up good commercial sites that are often already being used for affordable development, to make it easier for our affordable housing developers to build on those sites as well. And I think there is a path forward, and I look forward to that next year. And as Jeff noted in the chat, when I'm talking about labor, I'm really just talking about the state building trades.
Yeah, I guess I'll go quickly. Like Marina, I think an ongoing source is critical. We are not going to be able to do the long-term investments that we need to do, whether it's rental subsidies, operational subsidies, whatever the needs are. We need resources to do that, and we have to get creative about where those sources will come from. So I think that that's going to be a primary issue coming up this next year. Chris, the bills that you refer to, I think we have some really great opportunity in the office on homelessness, as well as figuring out how we do a better job collecting our data and setting real goals at population level reductions in homelessness. We cannot continue to talk about how, one set of bills and this set of bills is going to tinker around the edges. We have to be bold and figure out, we have 150,000 plus individuals and families who are unsheltered every night in California. What are we going to do to make sure that they have housing? Full stop. I'm tired of having circular conversations about this issue, and the solutions that we bring forward are inadequate. So I think we have to have a reckoning about, are we serious about disrupting the cycle of homelessness and housing insecurity, and ensuring that people who live in affordable housing aren't falling into homelessness because we have an economic crisis that we're contending with. So I feel like we have to have some honest and courageous conversations. We need to support our policymakers to be courageous, and we need to support our stakeholders and allies to get out of our silos, get out of our ideology, and come up with solutions that actually help the people on the ground who are relying on us to do a better job.
I'll just be very quick and say I want to endorse the notion that I think we really need to expand revenue. And that, it's been particularly highlighted by where the gaps are now. And if we do need to look to the federal government, but we're the fifth largest economy. We need to be able to support the work that we all see as being necessary to create the state that we want to create. And part of that is investing in affordable housing and investing in solutions to homelessness. And we need the revenue to do that. And we need a permanent ongoing source. And building a coalition that is broader than just housing is going to be critical to that.
Sorry, I know we want to move on, but I just wanted to add a bit. Also, that when I'm thinking about sort of an ongoing source, like, I don't want to necessarily be fighting for a new tax that goes to housing, but really a commitment from our leaders that we spend state resources on housing. The state has a very large budget and has not prioritized housing funding from that budget. We used to have redevelopment funding that at least we had $1 billion a year that was going to affordable housing development through that program. And since that was eliminated to close the budget hole, we have seen some commitments here and there, but without sort of a significant of ongoing money, we can't address the problems that we've been talking about today. And then we also can't build a pipeline of skilled workers to do the work, knowing that there is this funding that exists on an ongoing basis. And so we can't keep building in this, we do a housing bond, it funds housing for a couple years, then we do it again. We need to have this consistent revenue coming in so we can really address these problems in a very consistent fashion.
Yeah, I ditto to pretty much what everyone said. And to build off that, I want to mention two things. I think the revenue discussion is absolutely going to be in key and core moving forward. I think it takes a both and approach. I think we need a commitment from the state that I agree, Marina. I think we have to have that commitment in an ongoing way. But at the same time, we also are facing, our budget took, an incredibly large hit this last year. And we don't want that to hit the backs of people that are low income, people that are experiencing homelessness. And the way we avoid that is through potentially a new tax. And so, especially as we see this wealth gap that has only been exacerbated over the last 6 months to an almost incredibly rough way that we've seen the way things play out, just being blunt, that we need to make sure that people are paying their fair share and that they're helping people of low income. And so, with that being said, we've seen a couple revenue sources that were introduced at the end of the session here that got a hearing, but not even a vote. We heard the governor talk about a revenue source back in February. But I think, as housing and homelessness advocates, we are, steadfast. I think all of us are on the same page here, and that we need to start building the coalition for a new revenue source in the coming budget cycle and legislative cycle. I completely agree and feel a lot of the frustrations that we're doing one-time funds. And, we hear from providers, you open up a new shelter this year, but then it has to close next year because you don't get the same amount of funding or funds in the following year. And those people are back out on the streets. Same goes for maintaining the operations of units across the state. So, we need that certainty, we need that ongoing funding, and it needs a priority. And so we are working on that. That's not an empty plug there. We are working on that as advocates to find a new revenue source. And, not quite ready to fully announce that, but if folks are curious and want to join that effort, feel free to reach out to myself. And then the other thing I wanted to plug before we move to questions is, since I started at Housing California 3 years ago, we've worked on a bill that works on arguably the most disenfranchised group of people experiencing homelessness, which is people exiting prisons and people that have next to no opportunity leaving prison. And so we worked on a bill that would have reformed an existing CDCR program 3 straight years. I know my colleague and partner Sharon has worked on that legislation for over 13 years. And we are here where we are, where that program was actually eliminated in the budget this year. And so, I think we as a state really need to look at, as we are, in response to COVID, releasing people from prison early, and thousands and tens of thousands of people have next to no opportunity when they're exiting. And we really need to focus as a state on that population as well, and be really intentional about that because of the challenges they face when it comes to applying for housing, when it comes to applying for jobs, when it comes to the benefits that we provide them in mental health services and housing resources. I hope that in the next year we can revive those conversations in light of that program being eliminated, and maybe start from scratch. And make sure that our state Department of Corrections is working with our housing department, our housing agency, and being really intentional about that. So I do want to make that plug. So with that, we can move to some questions. I'm thinking the first one I think is probably one for Brian, which is about 3088 and that final at the bottom of the bill. It mentions working with stakeholders to plan for how to spend future federal relief dollars to support low-income tenants, and they asked about whether this process will be meaningful and what are the best ways for housing justice organizations to engage in that.
Yeah, and I think so. What the question is reflecting is the very last provision in that bill basically states the intent of the legislature to prioritize that funding as financial relief for housing providers, including affordable housing providers and tenants and small landlords. And so, it's not clear to me what that process looks like, but I think in some respects it is the process that we're all familiar with, of talking to our legislators and talking to representatives in the governor's office and elevating the need to prioritize that money in the way that we think. Marina highlighted a moment ago the critical issues that affordable housing providers are facing, and I think getting into that conversation now will help to elevate that question. It all depends on when the dollars come down and how much, if any, there are. But we also, I think, need to be talking to each of our legislators about that problem and about the problems that tenants are facing and the need for financial relief, so that when the legislature reconvenes in January to kind of tackle phase 2 of this, of 3088, that those policy choices are very clear in everyone's minds.
Thank you, Brian. That's a good one. So the question from Jeff Levin about there seems to be a bit of tension between calls for social ownership and calls to expand conventional home ownership as wealth building, particularly for people of color. And so wondering about how we handle that question.
As soon as I said it, I knew somebody was going to point that out. But I think I wish we could get Jeff and others to weigh in on that. I think there is a tension, right? It's an inherent tension. But I don't feel like in the short term, we're going to sort of upset the capitalist private property ownership system that we live under, right? So we want to move as much of that, particularly rental housing, into social ownership to control speculation and stabilize folks But we also have to think about how we can address long-term inequities in terms of wealth building. And one of the ways, for better or for worse, that we do that in America is through property ownership and through home ownership. And there are other solutions, and we should lift those up as well. But I think we've got to address those disparities in some respect. Do any of my other panelists want to address any of that?
Well, I guess I would just add, I think you answered the question, Brian. I would just add, I think, you know, wealth deprivation for this community is systemic and structural. And so to me, it's, you know, if we're providing rent to own opportunities for renters of color to get into property ownership, we need to be much more flexible and adaptive to the ways in which we provide access to home ownership that is commensurate with people's incomes. Because I think that that's the other challenge we have is, you know, social ownership or, you know, home ownership. Both of those are helpful, but I think we need to make sure that people of color can actually access those programs and access the resources to the housing. And I think you said that there was a 2-decade shortage, Brian, of people, of African-American folks owning homes in California.
Home ownership is a 2-decade-old low. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, come on now. These the trend lines continue to become normalized. That this is the new normal. That we don't have the wealth capacity within the communities that are most impacted by really federal government, you know, covenants and other policies that have prevented them from participating in home ownership. So, you know, we have to reconcile with those realities, whatever the tools.
Sorry, combing through here. I'd be curious about, this is something that I guess maybe this is just my own curiosity before I close here, if anyone wants to take this. There's a question about a joint housing development entity and using the regional, using it on a regional base with a public bank. You know, the public banking bill came up this year, and I'm curious if any of you engaged in that, and you know how you could see that as a way of affordable housing development and financing. Or did nobody watch that one?
We were not tracking that, but I think, you know, this idea of access to capital, Chris, is something that we think about certainly on, you know, for our extremely low income households who are business owners, having access to capital that allows them to maintain their businesses. We saw in Oakland a really significant impact of the COVID crisis on those business owners. 90% of people who applied for the loan fund that was put together by private philanthropy and many other stakeholders in Oakland, 90% of the people who applied were ELI business owners. So I think this idea of a public bank, either on the housing side or, you know, ways for the economic restructuring of our economy are considerations because it makes capital more accessible. You look at different credit requirements. You know, we hear a lot from our community-based organizations on the ground that one of the impediments for people trying to get rehoused is credit repair. And so there's a lot of the sort of products that a public bank having sort of a social mission could be responsive to make it easier. Even those who are formerly incarcerated, as you talked about earlier, being excluded from accessing federally funded housing, and their networks not having the wealth and security of housing they can return to. I think, again, a mission-driven bank approach could be really interesting to see if we could mitigate some of those negative impacts.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. And I'm thinking that I hope that bill comes up again next year and that conversation gets restarted and we can start to think about it as a sector about how the implications on on our work. Well, with that, I know we're at time. I want to thank Tamika, Marina, and Brian for sharing your knowledge and insight with us today about our collective efforts to advocate for homes for all in California. I want to additionally shout out Marina's organization, CHC, who is co-hosting today's sessions with us as we focus on advancing systems change and structural reform. CHC is a critical partner of ours, co-leading our legislative and budgetary advocacy in Sacramento to advance affordable housing development. Please be sure to visit the exhibit hall following sessions where you can win prizes, follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag HousingCA2020. We look forward to seeing everybody at the kitchen table talks shortly. We have the governor coming up first at 3 o'clock and then Assemblymember David Chu. And thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.